Welcome to the Art of Procurement podcast. I'm Philip Ideson, a 20-year procurement practitioner, former head of procurement, advisor to procurement leaders around the world, and the founder and managing director of Art of Procurement. My team and I work with our global network of subject matter experts to help companies elevate procurement's impact, whether that's through building and implementing transformation programs, sustainably reducing external expenses, or leveraging AOP Mastermind, our learning and development platform for companies of all sizes. You're listening to our flagship podcast where we pull back the curtain and shine a light on the strategies, tactics, and tools that leading procurement teams are using to align their results with the needs of the business. For many procurement teams, risk has become priority number one. But how can you make sense of all the unknowns out there to ensure that each one of your category strategies is as prepared as can be to adapt to whatever may come your way? Well, today I'm going to share one way that you can do this, and that's using the trusty business continuity and disaster recovery plan that we often ask our suppliers to provide to us, and actually applying the concepts within the BCPDR to your category strategy. Now, this approach can be used whether the category, product, or service in question has a physical supply chain, so it's something that is shipped, from point A to point B. And this is really important. It can actually be used if you have a virtual supply chain. What I've actually found is a lot of folks think, they're buying a service, then things like supply chain risk don't actually apply to them, but it does. If you think about a virtual supply chain for your services, can people get into the office? Do they have access to the equipment they need to provide the service that you're buying? Before I start, I do want to share, first of all, a little bit of context. If you're a subscriber to our regular newsletter, AOP Insider, you'll no doubt have read about the July 1st launch of AOP Mastermind. We built Mastermind as a way for procurement professionals at all levels to collaborate, network, benchmark, and grow in a face-to-face but virtual environment. It includes a number of different structured and action-oriented activities. It includes an executive mastermind program, CPO think tanks, procurement excellence roundtables. We have expert-led Q&As, and also structured learning workshops. Now, Mastermind has been 5 years in the making. All the different individual client programs that we've built over the years here at Art of Procurement, all coming together into a single product. And I tell you this to say that Mastermind includes a library of on-demand micro-learning courses. You basically choose a pre-built how-to course. And for no more than 15 minutes per lesson, we help you build a specific plan, a strategy, or a tactic to help you elevate your impact. An example of one of these micro-learning courses is a step-by-step guide to building a category continuity plan. Now, a category continuity plan helps you proactively identify the risks associated with your category or a particular product or service that you buy, and then identify proactive and reactive mitigation steps so you can actually be prepared, should a particular scenario occur. Now, there's 6 different elements to the process of creating your plan. First of all is understanding your inherent risk. Second is then mapping your supply chain. Third, planning out different risk scenarios. Fourth, identifying points of failure. Fifth is then determining which mitigation strategies to use. And then sixth and final is building out a response plan. Now, that might sound like a lot, but it doesn't actually have to be so. What we aren't looking for is a 60-page in-depth plan with step-by-step instructions on what to do if a risk event occurs. What we are doing is being better informed about how to identify and mitigate risks in your category and then be ready proactively should something happen. In our Mastermind micro-learning course, each one of these 6 elements will be presented as a different lesson with a template to complete or questions that we pose to you to help you for each category, product, or service, really to get you started in building your continuity plan. In today's podcast, I thought I'd provide an overview of each element so you at least have a good place to start. And the first element is really to understand your inherent risk. And by inherent risk, I mean the risk that exists that's specific to your category, your product or service, should you actually have no risk mitigation plans in place. What you really want to do is to identify which products or services that you receive that would actually cause a problem if you're faced with a supply issue or a problem within the physical or the virtual supply chain for that product or service. And the reason that you do this is that it just isn't possible to manage all risks at all times. So you want to focus on the things that you buy that are most important and have a higher level of risk. You can build out a formal risk identification process, or just ask yourself some common questions, questions such as how important is what you buy to your operations, from keeping the lights on to ensuring that your staff have everything they need to be successful. Is it critical? Is it nice to have? Is it really not that important? Now, how many alternate sources of supply exist? There are lots of alternate sources of supply. Are there not so many? Are there any readily available substitute products that would be acceptable and that are easy to implement? And then how long would it take to switch to an alternative supplier, if it even is possible at all? Is it something you can do immediately? Is it something that takes days, weeks, months? Is that time period acceptable, and how much would that cost? Answering these questions will help you decide whether or not you even need to complete a category continuity plan, or how deep you need to go in your due diligence. Now, for the rest of the elements, we'll actually assume that you're looking only at those categories, products or services that you have decided that you need to focus on. So the next step is to map your physical or virtual supply chain. Supply chain mapping is the process of mapping the supply chain to actually identify the source of every material, process step, or activity that's necessary to bring a product to your factory or your office, or that a service provider needs to be able to provide the services that you're buying from them. It helps us understand the complexity of a supply chain for any given product or service and identify potential points of failure, which is particularly helpful when developing mitigation plans for the products and services that we want to give that level of scrutiny to. Once we've mapped out what the supply chain looks like, you can start to stress test it by hypothesizing the impact of various different scenarios. And this is the scenario planning stage. Now, the scenarios that you're going to use will differ, based on your own business, but here are some examples. It could be that a country where you have a number of suppliers, or there are tier 2 or tier 3 suppliers, that country has a debt crisis that severely restricts the ability of suppliers to access credit to fund working capital requirements. Another scenario could be the end country where your products are shipped actually increases an import tax that, costs go up 50% as a result of that import tax. Another one is that a major port or an airport that's a major part of your supply chain or is close to your major distribution center, for example, is subject to a sudden labor strike that has no end in sight. What would that mean for your products, services that you buy? Another could be an earthquake, a tsunami, a flood. It destroys manufacturing sites or service centers, or I've seen this happen in the IT space in Chennai, where server rooms, for example, all of a sudden they're damaged and they just go offline. What would happen if that occurs? Again, how would that impact on the products or service that you buy? And then finally, and this is by no means a fully inclusive list, but this is of particular relevance right now. What happens if there's another wave of coronavirus and various different locations have to go back into lockdown mode? So as you're doing that and you're looking at those scenarios, you want to consider, what is the impact of that scenario across what you buy? The financial risk, the business continuity risk, is there any reputational risk, for example? And then identify and rank any key points of failure in that supply chain as a result of that event that would then require mitigation. You can identify specific points of failure, which is the next kind of part of building this category continuity plan, by using tools such as, and I'm just going to give you one example here, as FMEA, which is Failure Mode and Effects Analysis. So FMEA is a risk assessment tool. It's actually been used for a number of different years, to look at processes, to look at design. It's used a lot in engineering, but it's also more and more used in the risk world as well, to really help evaluate the severity, the likely occurrence, and the impact of a risk. That really then helps you prioritize which kind of points of failure within that supply chain should an event occur. That's where you need to focus your mitigation efforts. So if you think about a supply chain map that you built, for each part of the map, there's connections from point A to point B, whether that's something being shipped from point A to B, whether it's somebody who works in a certain area needing to get to an office in another location, whatever it may be, there's things that move from point A to B so that your services can be delivered, so your products can be built and shipped. So you want to be asking yourself 3 questions basically for each one of those kind of points between the two, what are called nodes. What's the likely severity on the overall supply chain of an event happening? So first, severity. Next, probability. So what's the probability of a risk event impacting that part of the supply chain? And third is actually how easy is it to detect a problem or a risk event in advance of it occurring, because the easier it is to detect that a problem is going to happen, the more time that you actually have to react to it. FMEA actually provides a scoring model that helps you quantitatively determine the points of failure that would have the biggest impact. And then this can be a prioritization list for building your mitigation strategy or strategies. And so that developing of mitigation strategies is actually the 5th part of the category continuity plan. And here are some of the most common mitigation strategies. I'm sure that you've used all of these at some point in time, or at least a combination of these. But these are some that, capture pretty much most of the mitigation strategies that organizations can use in response to risk events, proactively and reactively. So one of them is make versus buy. So should you be bringing what you're buying in-house? In the most extreme cases, this might actually involve investing in or outright buying your supplier if there's a risk event that happens kind of unexpectedly. And this actually happened throughout the manufacturing supply chain quite often during the financial crisis, 12 years ago, where critical suppliers actually had significant leverage due to how difficult it was to switch providers. Another mitigation strategy is looking at specifications, whether you need to rescope, re-engineer those. You can look at dual sourcing. We actually did an article about the perils of dual sourcing. Not that it's a bad thing, but it's just something you have to do with care, because there's a risk of dual sourcing, but then introducing other risks like geographic concentration risk. But I think that's one of the things that's going to be kind of pushed to us as probably more than ever before as procurement professionals. How can we make sure that we have alternative sources of supply? That along with nearshoring, how can we bring supply chains and services closer to our core offices? We've just spent the last 20 years outsourcing everything all around the world, for good reasons from a cost and efficiency and sometimes an expertise perspective. But there's definitely going to be when you look at a risk lens, a consideration of whether some of that is going to be brought either back in-house, goes back to that make or buy, or whether we're going to be nearshoring it. So at least there's less kind of distance to travel between those locations and our core hubs within our organization. Another mitigation strategy is looking at your inventory and inventory management. Another one is looking in your KPIs, having increased governance. You may have identified potential risks that, maybe they don't have easy mitigation strategies. And in that case, you want to have a lot closer governance so that you can really put in place an early warning system for potential problems in the future. And the last one I wanted to share, this is more of a longer term mitigation plan. So, maybe it's something you need to start thinking about now with some of your most important suppliers. And that's a much stronger focus on partnership. So when there are shortages or issues, the stronger your relationship, the closer to the top of the list you are, from both a communication and a risk mitigation or business continuity perspective. It's really hard to foster this overnight, as I was saying, especially if it's been overlooked so far. But one idea you could do is actually to proactively help any vulnerable suppliers get the insights they need, giving them some free consulting basically to help them access emergency funds through various loans programs, or help them with their own expense management. There's things that you can do that you can turn on pretty much right now that's going to start building stronger relationships with those suppliers, a stronger focus on partnership, even if you haven't actually paid much attention to that over the past year, 2 years, however long that relationship with that supplier has been. But just know those things may not have an immediate impact when it comes to strengthening of the partnership and building trust, because that does take a little bit longer. And then finally, with mitigation strategies in place, the final element of your category continuity plan is to be prepared to respond to a risk event. And there's typically 3 different types of risk events that are going to require some kind of a response. you can have, first of all, a change in conditions. So this can be a worsening, it can actually be an improvement in conditions across these physical or virtual supply chains that change the risk profile of what it is that you're buying, they change the failure points, they change the impact or severity of the risk. So a change in conditions is based really on the emergence of new information. That's something that you just need to be continuing to kind of be proactive to spot through some risk monitoring. There is an impending event. This is also based on new information, but it's a lot easier to spot. It could be a forecasted storm, a labor strike that's announced, an upcoming election, perhaps a change in regulatory requirements that impact your industry or the products or the services that you buy. And by their nature, changes in conditions or an impending event, they mean that this risk event has not yet occurred. So if you can spot them, you're able to respond to them. And if you've asked those questions, you performed at the beginning that we talked about to identify those categories where you even need a continuity plan for. If you perform the additional due diligence we've talked about a little bit through the pod, then you'll know exactly where to focus your efforts to ensure continuity of supply, and that the impending event that you can see coming has a minimal impact, while more than likely your competitors are still trying to figure out where to start. You can get that head start. And then the third event is the event that happens without warning. It's the type of event where the phone rings at 4 o'clock in the morning, and these types of events require an immediate response. And they can be a natural disaster, an act of terror, the power grid may go down, there may be a fire at a major supplier site, there could be a data security issue, political unrest. Lots of different things can happen and flare up pretty much overnight. As I said before, where you have changes in conditions or an impending event that you can see coming, you have a little bit more time on your side. But these unexpected or unthinkable events require more of a reactive response. But if you have this category continuity plan, you're going to know exactly what to do. A good example of something you can do to be prepared in this phase is really, as well as having those mitigation plans ready, is to have identified the people who would make up your risk response team. What are their roles and responsibilities? That's really important because sometimes when something happens, the first thing you're doing is you're coming into the office, you're not really sure where to start. Just having a good idea of when something happens, where to start, how to form the team, who are the people that should be involved, getting the kickoff call so you can actually figure out what to do next. If you're able to mobilize a response that quickly, then you're kind of ahead of the game. So that's really the least that you can do. So while your competitors are still then trying to figure out how to react, you're already executing those strategic plans that you developed before. You're able to pull together that kind of crisis or event response team that you've built into your category continuity plan. You're already taking the steps to understand, to normalize the situation and as much as possible to eradicate the impact of the risk event. And that's where, as a procurement professional, you really have the opportunity to step up and take the lead, because in a crisis, no one has all the answers. But by being as prepared as possible and ready to mobilize your category continuity plan, you're going to be really well placed to turn your response into something that is not only, positions you really well internally, but can actually be a competitive advantage for your organization. So that's it for today's podcast. This has been adapted from one of our micro-learning courses that are available to all members of our AOP Mastermind community. And as I shared at the start, we built Mastermind as a way for procurement professionals at all levels to collaborate, network, benchmark, and grow in this face-to-face but virtual environment. We have a number of different structured and action-oriented activities within Mastermind, including an executive mastermind program, at the CPO think tank sessions, we have procurement excellence roundtables, expert-led Q&As, and structured learning workshops. And then, of course, the library of micro-learning courses, including this one, tools and templates. If you would like to know a little bit more about Mastermind, you can visit artofprocurement.com/mastermind. That's artofprocurement.com/mastermind. Okay, be safe, and I'll be back again with another podcast next Monday at 6 a.m. Eastern Time.